Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Haftarah study for Parashat Devarim. So we've just moved past the Parsha of this previous Shabbat, and so we're going to learn the Haftarah that'll be for this coming Shabbat. I've got to give my little brief intro shtick as usual. Although I think, given the company this morning, you've probably heard it already. The Haftarah is from what they call the rest of Nach, or at least what I call the Nach, the Nivi'im and the Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings, and specifically from the prophetic books. Usually it has some kind of thematic connection to the Parsha, although in our example, both this week and next week, it's actually more relevant to the season. It's more relevant to the occasion. This one, both the Haftarah we're going to do this week, and in 2 weeks we have another session coming up, relates to the holiday of Tisha B'Av, which is coming up towards the end of July. And actually this one is sort of leading up to it, and the one after is for after Tisha B'Av. So they kind of connect, but from different angles. And it's been really great studying Haftarah with everyone so far, because I feel like it often gets passed over in synagogue. We don't even always read it out loud, or if we do, it's fairly opaque, and it's seldom the topic of study or drash. And the verses that are read for Haftarah have varied among Jewish communities. So I've taken a certain amount of creative license in terms of deciding what to read on any given week, especially since we're recording on Sundays, and we're in a bit of a liminal space in between last Shabbat and the coming one. But it's worked out so well so far. So here's the plan. We'll go over a bit of a summary of the Torah portion, and we'll do some background on the book that the Haftarah comes from, and building familiarity over the course of the year. And one thing that's really cool, we're going to encounter a new prophetic book today, but we'll touch back on it next week. And I'll explain why it's actually really cool to get the same book twice in a row, because we'll be reading different parts of it. And then we'll dive in and read and see what comes up. In general, I found really useful questions to ask along the way, and we'll make sure to address these specifically at the end. How did this text speak to people at the time that it was written? Who was it written for? Who was the contemporary audience reading it? And how might they have reacted to it? How did the text speak to Jewish communities between then and now? Who chose it to be the Haftarah, the portion? Why might it have been chosen for that purpose? And how might it have spoken to communities who read it at different times? And also, how does it speak to us now? What sort of contemporary resonance does this have for us, given everything in the world around us? So the Parsha for this coming Shabbat is Parashat Devarim. We're entering the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, so the last of the 5 books of the Torah. And I'll give you a quick summary, even though our Haftarah doesn't actually connect necessarily to the Parsha. But since we'll be reading Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy takes the form, purports to be the content of basically Moses' speech to the Israelites as they're assembled and preparing to cross and enter into the land of Israel. So Moses begins his final words of instruction to the children of Israel, recounting first their physical journey, reviewing the people's reactions to various negative reports, like the negative report of the spies, and Moses' appointment of Joshua to succeed him. And he recounts all of the Israelite warriors who left Egypt, how they died as God had intended, and the people continued wandering after that, defeating their enemies. And reiterates how the land of Israel has been allocated to the various Israelite tribes. The whole thing is basically a recapitulation, a resummation of a lot of what we've covered so far. But the Haftarah that's read this week is actually the third of 3 Haftarot that are read in sequence leading up on the 3 Shabbatot leading up to the holiday of Tisha B'Av. And so this is what they call the third of 3 Haftarot of affliction. So if you're not familiar, on the holiday of Tisha B'Av, we recall the destruction of both temples, the first temple in 586 BC and the second temple in the year 70 CE. And it's sort of become this day of mourning and remembrance for destruction of temples, but really all kinds of suffering that Jews have undergone, you know, over our history. And it's a day of fasting and of solemnity. And we read the book of Lamentations, which is a lament for the city of Jerusalem. We'll see some kind of tie-ins to that in our Parsha, or in our Haftarah portion today. And so in the lead up to basically help us get in the right frame of mind for Tisha B'Av, we read these Haftarot. So we continue the Torah cycle as it normally progresses, but the Haftarot take on a special character of you know, I think affliction is an okay word, but they're chastising in some way. You know, they still end on an up note. You know, one thing that always stays consistent is that the Haftarah never leaves us on a down note, on a note of, you know, rebuke or sadness or anything like that. So it still ends on a little bit of an up note, but you'll note that the text as a whole is really a chastisement. You know, well, you'll see what you know, how you want to describe it. But it's all part of this process of getting us in the right frame of mind for Tisha B'Av. And we'll see that the Haftarot that follow also react to that. They're called Haftarot of consolation, and they're designed to help kind of lift us up out of those depths over the succeeding weeks. Okay, so the parsha we're going to read, the Haftarah portion we're going to read this week is from the book of Isaiah, and it's in fact from the very beginning of the book of Isaiah. We start at chapter 1, verse 1. So to give you a little background, and actually it's nearly the entirety of the first chapter. It's verses 1 through 27. I think the chapter is about 30 or 31 verses long. The Haftarah kind of snips off the end of the chapter, I think basically for the reason of you want to end on an up note. We can look at those verses if we have time and see what you think. But so we're reading from the very beginning of Isaiah. And Isaiah is, you know, we talked about yet. Isaiah is perhaps the best loved of all the prophetic books. It's cited more than any other book in rabbinic literature. There are more Haftarot from Isaiah than from any other prophetic book. Many of the proof texts for some of Judaism's main tenets, in other words, the texts that the rabbis referred to in order to back up their claims that this is an important value, things like messianism, the idea that there's going to be, you know, both some kind of redeeming figure and also an era to come, is grounded in Isaiah. Centrality of Jerusalem, you know, in terms of being the center of the Jewish world, you know, it's expressed in many places, but the rabbis point specifically to Isaiah as the grounding proof text for that. Economic and social justice. Some of that we'll hear this morning, and there's many other texts as well. Isaiah speaks directly to those kind of ideas frequently. Most of the book is poetry, and one thing about biblical poetry is it does not play by the rules of poetry as we frequently know them, as we learn, you know, in high school. So there's not always a clear rhyme scheme. You know, the meter is sometimes a little complex or elusive, and you know, frequently the vocabulary is, you know, it's not very common, which makes it difficult to pin down exact meanings. And what that means is when we read Isaiah, it's not always clear maybe where one particular prophecy begins and ends, especially in the first half of the book of Isaiah. It's not always clear whether he is trying to comfort people or castigate them. It's not always clear if he's predicting future events or explaining past events. The way Hebrew verbs work, it can sometimes be ambiguous, and it's made more ambiguous by the poetic setting for this. You know, so we'll be working with a translation that has sort of clarified some of those ambiguities for us, but we may come up to some points where, you know, it's open to our interpretation. Do we think this is you know, supposed to become, you know, positive or negative, right? Or talk about the future or the past or the present, right? That may be deliberately ambiguous, and that leaves it up to us to make sense of for ourselves. Isaiah is long. It's very long, but there are two distinct sections that scholars think basically date to entirely different eras. The first 39 chapters are what we call First Isaiah, and are attributed to Isaiah, who is the son of Amoz, who lived in Jerusalem during the last half of the 8th century. So that's between about 750 and the year 700 BCE. And, you know, we know that because, for one thing, it says right at the beginning of the book, we'll read, there's kind of an introductory verse. But the content that seems to be ascribed fits that historical setting. However, once you get to chapter 40, in between chapter 40 and chapter 66, there's a noticeable shift. And even though it's all collected into one book of Isaiah, there's not any kind of reintroduction. It's, you know, it's all part of the same book. Scholars identify that as coming from a different hand. It's usually called Second Isaiah, or sometimes Deutero-Isaiah, actually just like Deuteronomy, which means second telling. So it's a second Isaiah. And it seems that the second half of the book was composed much later, probably during and after the Babylonian exile, which was in the 6th century, between 586 and about 538 BCE. So what's cool about this Haftarah of affliction this week before Tisha B'Av is it's from First Isaiah, and we're going to read the first, one of the Haftarot of consolation in our next Haftarah study, which actually comes from Deutero-Isaiah. So we'll be able to actually compare and contrast on back-to-back weeks the difference between those two. Let's see. Questions so far. How are we doing with the book of Isaiah? I have more to say specifically about First Isaiah, but please, by all means, jump in with any questions at any time. I can see all of you, so if you like raise your hands or anything like that, I'll make sure to recognize you. Are we doing okay so far? Any questions? Okay. Okay.
No, I was just confused because I looked up, and supposedly the readings for today were first Jeremiah, for Matot.
I'm sorry?
I think it's Matot.
Matot. That's what we read last week, Stephanie.
Right. Yeah, so that was yesterday is Shabbat.
Oh, okay.
Right. So as soon as you get actually as far as Shabbat Mincha, like you get as far as Shabbat afternoon, you read the next week's portion.
Okay.
So it gets a little confusing because for a lot of folks, when they get to Shabbat morning, that's actually the first time they're reading the portion. But it's actually the end of the sort of period of time where you know that portion is in season, right? So we're on to next week's already.
Maseh, then?
Matot Maseh? Yeah, and that's doubly confusing this week because yesterday's Shabbat portion was a double. Matot and Maseh were combined.
Oh, no wonder I'm way behind.
Yep. That's okay.
I try to read them before we come to it, and so.
Sorry.
Okay.
Well, so you did read that. Actually, so I thought about doing the one from Jeremiah because I was like, oh, maybe I want to do two different books, Jeremiah. We'll meet Jeremiah again at some point.
Okay.
But that was also one of the Haftarot of affliction, because those Parshiot always fall after the 17th of Tammuz, and so you also read a Haftarah of affliction, just not the one we're going to talk about today. Okay. You get full credit for doing your homework. That's great.
Well, okay. Except I did the wrong homework, so it doesn't really.
Okay, there are no grades.
The good news is the dog didn't eat it.
Yeah, the dog did right, and there are no grades. Right, that's right. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about First Isaiah and kind of the historical figure of Isaiah the prophet. So, like I said, he lived in the last half of the 8th century. There's some thought that he was potentially a member of the royal court in Jerusalem. He definitely seems like he has access to the kings, although we don't get a lot of biographical details otherwise. He appears in some other books of the Bible, and as we'll encounter an example of that today. So he's attested from multiple different angles, as well as his own book. But still, we don't necessarily, we don't get that description of sort of who he was or his upbringing or things like that. So he's both kind of well attested and also relatively obscure in that way. He's clearly addressing current events of his day, but also rarely tells us what those events were. His audience, of course, would have known immediately what it was he was talking about, because they would have known, what was going on in their world. They would have heard the stories in the marketplace, right? Just like we know what's going on in the news, but he doesn't go and retell us exactly what those events were. So it's sometimes a game of trying to match up what is Isaiah talking about with what we know of the historical record. So to help us with that, as we do that today, a little bit of a review of the historical setting in the 8th century. So in about the first half of the 8th century, so we're talking about 800 BCE down to about 750-ish, the Assyrian Empire, which was based in what today is kind of northern Iraq, southeast Turkey. The Assyrian Empire was on the rise, and their ascent put pressure on these small kingdoms along the Mediterranean coast, including Israel and Judah. You will recall at this point, what was the United Monarchy under the kings Saul and David and Solomon had split into northern and southern kingdoms. The northern called Israel, the southern called Judah, and they maintained this kind of side by side, independent but linked relationship down to about the year 722. And the reason the story, at least for the northern kingdoms, is there is because these small kingdoms sometimes accepted Syria as their overlord and would pay tribute to the Assyrian king, just to make sure that they're not harassed by the army and they're able to maintain their independence. Sometimes they would revolt, frequently turning to Egypt, which was the other sort of great power at the time, as their ally. That usually ended in disaster. And in fact, that's exactly what happened for the northern kingdom. They revolted against the Assyrian Empire, looking to Egypt for support. That didn't come through. And in about 722, the Assyrian army came through and wiped out the northern kingdom, deported a lot of that population to the east, as was part of their program to pacify the area, make sure that the people were rootless and not able to raise popular sentiment against the empire. And we'll talk about what happened to the southern kingdom at that time too. They were also implicated in this, but not destroyed, as you'll see. So for Isaiah, who is, remember, in Jerusalem, which is part of the southern kingdom, this posed a religious question. The destruction of the north in 722 posed this religious question. Basically, to what extent should the Judeans either attempt to confront their enemies using the usual military and diplomatic means, usually allying with other nations, and to what extent should they fight independently, free of those alliances, and in his religious view, basically just rely solely on God. As you might expect, Isaiah preferred the latter. He seemed to think that other nations were untrustworthy, and God was the only one worthy of our confidence, and God would be the protector of Judah. So that's one of his kind of major themes. There was another major trend at the time, which was the growth of large estates that were owned by aristocrats, and consequent impoverishment among the peasants. So Isaiah, in addition to speaking out against alliances with other nations, also spoke out against the accumulation of great wealth, and what he felt as kind of the haughtiness of the rich. As we think about modern connections, some things never change. He spoke out against this kind of abuse of wealth and the sort of entitlement idea that he felt like the rich folks of his time had. Overall, his other main themes, like we said, Jerusalem, central Jerusalem's the holy city, and specifically in Isaiah's view, he predicted that Jerusalem would never fall to Judah's enemies. we'll talk about the consequences of that, because obviously it did fall at some point later. Social and economic justice, like we said. He talks about a what he calls a remnant of Israel, basically a group of survivors that would survive some kind of enormous catastrophe that God would send to punish the nation for its lack of faith and its hypocrisy. That would then serve as kind of the kernel to sprout a purified Israel that would be renewed. So he often talks about a remnant being left, but towards the end of kind of, I guess, like winnowing away the chaff to leave just the pure kernel behind. He anticipated the dawn of a new era in which all nations would recognize the one true God. And in his view, it's not so much like a kind of supremacist view. It's not like a conquering subjugation thing. It's more that everyone kind of gets it and understands that the God of Israel is the one true God, and that basically just ends all competition between the nations. So it's not as that Israel, in Isaiah's view, necessarily dominates them. It's just that all the warfare and competition stops. And in his vision, a Judean king, who of course would be a descendant of David, would come to rule all Israel and thus the world in perfect justice. That's where we construct the idea in Judaism of Messiah and Messianic era, although Isaiah himself never actually calls it that. That's sort of a later idea projected back onto Isaiah, but using his his ideas as the kind of undergirding. And like a lot of prophets, only God can be great in his view. Anything that he considers haughty will be reduced to its proper place, whether it's the rich or kings and rulers, or even, as we'll see particularly next week, even tall mountains will be reduced to their proper place. Basically, everything that's not God is going to be put in its proper place at this time to come. And it's in Isaiah's view, it's this kind of haughtiness, this kind of thinking that you are somehow at all powerful compared to God. That's where all sin and all hypocrisy comes from. I would say fairly in line with other prophets in that regard, but that's kind of Isaiah's specific. Like he sort of gets the most credit for that idea, as it were. Okay. How are we doing so far? Questions about Isaiah, background, or anything like that on the prophet or his book? All right. Let's jump in and read that. I'm going to pull up my screen share. Okay. A few other windows going. Here we go. Okay. All right. So specifically with regard for our Haftarah selection today, like I said, this is the third of three Haftarot of affliction that we read each year between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. And in the sort of relived, the calendar sort of reenacts the events of history. The 17th of Tammuz is when the Babylonian army breached the city walls in Jerusalem. And the 9th of Av is when they made it as far as the temple and actually destroyed the temple. So we're sort of in the middle of that lived reenactment of the story. We're going to read the Book of Lamentations, Eicha in Hebrew, on Tisha B'Av, and you'll note a lot of similarities in between the language there and the mournful tone that's found here at the beginning of Isaiah. And it makes sense for that reason in terms of why this is the Haftarah of affliction immediately preceding the holiday. Chapter 1, which we're going to read from, it seems to be kind of an introductory prophecy. There's basically, all those main themes that I talked about are kind of present here. It covers all First Isaiah's main themes, and it's possible that this was a single speech, a single prophecy that's just especially comprehensive, and so it made sense to put it at the beginning of the book. It's also possible it was written specifically as a summary of the contents of the book as a whole, because that's effectively what it does in a lot of ways, is kind of cover Isaiah's main themes, at least up through the first 39 chapters, through first Isaiah. Like we said, what comes after that is its own thing, and we'll talk about at another time. Okay. So the first verse, which I'll go ahead and read, because honestly, there's nothing to it. The prophecies of Isaiah, son of Amoz, who prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotam, Achaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. Isaiah himself almost certainly did not write this line. It's a superscription, basically a title written later by a later editor who was compiling all this stuff into one book. Indicates the author, time in which the author works, and it matches up here. This is where we get our sense of Isaiah's dates. Those looking at what we, comparing what we know of those kings from other sources. We're talking about 740 to 700 BCE, somewhere in that era, right in and around that northern kingdom destruction in 722. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. Stephanie, you were at the top of my screen. Would you mind reading first from source number 2 there?
Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, and they have rebelled against me. An ox knows its owner, and ass its master's crib. Israel does not know. My people takes no thought. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, brood of evildoers, depraved children. They have forsaken the Lord, spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs.
Very good. Okay, so this is like, he's laying into Israel right away here, right? I feel like I can imagine this being, I can almost imagine Isaiah standing in the public square and yelling this, right, at everyone, like, right? Like it has that kind of almost like street corner prophet kind of vibe to it to me. One thing to note quickly about the kind of literary form, there's a framing device being used here. A common way in biblical literature to kind of delineate the beginning and end of a unit is with some kind of repeated phrase. So we'll see that line, for the Lord has spoken. That'll come up in about 20 verses. And we'll think again at that point about what that might, what that means. But, this indicates that the first chunk of this is kind of one unit. And it also highlights a key feature of prophetic literature, which is basically the prophet saying, it's not me saying this, it's God, right? Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. This is what I'm telling you, what God said, right? The prophet sets himself up as the kind of mediator, right, in between God and the people. Okay. Let me ask you this. If this were read aloud in, say, a courtroom, what would you call this part? Like, what part of the trial would this be?
The preamble.
What do you mean preamble?
He's setting the stage for what he's going to lay it on in a minute. Okay.
No, we didn't get any of our community members who are lawyers here, right? I don't think any of you are lawyers, right?
No.
I'm not either. But you're right. This is the beginning of the trial when we're laying out, why we're even here, right? I'm pretty sure that's called, and I wish a lawyer was here to make sure I'm right, I would call that the indictment.
Yeah.
Right? This is the indictment. Here's what
I know.
Yeah.
I think it's called opening. Is it called opening remarks?
They're like, yeah, it's something like that. Opening arguments,
Yeah.
right? It's when we're saying, here's what this guy is on trial for, right? Or in his case, Israel. Here's what Israel is on trial for. They're rebelling, right? They're rebelling against God. So what are the charges then? What is, I guess what I'm asking is, what does rebelling against God mean? Like, can you try to explain specifically what it means to rebel against God? Your best guesses.
Well, I think in this sense, he puts it into quite the context,
Right.
because he calls in the heavens and the earth, all of creation.
Right.
And what it's basically saying is, here are these creatures created too, who aren't doing what they should be. The heavens are moving like they should. The earth is growing, all the plants.
Sure.
Yeah, the moon and the stars, you're in alignment, but
good.
Yeah,
Good.
these creatures, they've blown it.
How do we, so right, and meaning us, or for Isaiah, the people of Judah that he's prophesying to, right?
Well, even the ox and the ass, for crying out loud.
Right. Right.
They know their place.
Right, good. So, right, even the animals know what to do. They're following their, their sort of appointed roles. How do we, as the Jews, know what we're supposed to do? This is a little bit of an academic question, but I want us to say it out loud. How do we know what it is we're supposed to be doing?
Well, Moses had supposedly laid down all of.
Perfect. And what do we call that whole agreement in between Moses and the Israelites and God that governs our whole relationship? What do we call that?
Covenant.
Perfect. Excellent, Stephanie.
I didn't hear that.
The covenant, right?
Covenant.
Yeah.
Very nice. Covenant. Good. So the charges here in these opening arguments, Israel's breaking the covenant, right? You want to take any guesses as to how they might be doing that? We're gonna get deep into it.
Not following the Ten Commandments.
Sure. All right. There's a lot of the covenant involves a lot of different stuff, both ritual mitzvot, right? And things like observing the Sabbath and keeping kosher, things that are understood to be between an individual and God, and also interpersonal mitzvot, right? The way we treat other people with kindness and respect, doing tzedakah and justice and mercy and all those kind of stuff, or all those kind of ideas. That's all part of the same covenant. So we'll see actually what specifically Isaiah sees as the violation of the covenant here.
What does the word iniquity mean?
It's a good I would say it's something like wrongdoing. Here, let me get. I want to get a good. It definitely means like iniquity. I'm going to get a good definition for us here. Iniquity: immoral or grossly unfair behavior.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there we go. It's doing the wrong thing, but like really doing the wrong thing.
It's like wicked.
Yeah, wickedness, right?
And or very unjust.
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I think he's the translation is trying to use a lot of similar Hebrew words and map them onto English, like sinful, iniquity, evildoers, depraved. Right. Those are all getting at the same idea. But remember, this is poetic, so he's saying it 4 different ways to really emphasize the point.
I just looked this up, and the root of it is in, like the in is not,
right.
And the quity is from equal.
Or like equity, sure.
Right, yeah.
Not equity. Yeah, that makes sense. Nice. Yeah. Amy, you touched on this briefly, but let's name it specifically. Why does Isaiah invoke the heavens and the earth here?
Well, actually, that's done frequently in biblical writings when you want to, when you're addressing the population, you bring in something beyond. It's a way of bringing in God's glory.
It's true. Yes, although, yes, it does happen. It does happen frequently. But there's actually like a specific connection that Isaiah is making. So I mean, we should say, for granted, when you make an agreement with somebody, and this is just as true today as it was, just like we would sign a contract today, we want to have witnesses who sign that contract to make sure, that we're agreeing to things and that everything's on the up and up, right? In the ancient world, they would do the same things. Who is going to be who could possibly be the witness to something as huge and magnificent as a covenant between God and the people of Israel?
The heavens and the earth.
Heaven and earth. And as a matter of fact, that's there's I give you the sort of the key link here to there's multiple places where this comes up, but it was nicely stated explicitly in this verse from Deuteronomy. I call heaven and earth this day to witness against you. This is part of Moses's speech saying, recalling what happened previously several books ago at Mount Sinai, kind of recollecting that event. The heavens and the earth are basically brought to bear to be the witnesses to this agreement. It's something that, it's a contract, but one that it's not just not just something on paper between people. It's almost like a contract that involves the entire universe. Now somehow we sort of are part of this cosmic courtroom taking place and witnessing this agreement being made, right?
That's what I was thinking, that God created everything.
Right.
But he created the heavens and he created the earth.
Right.
But there's a little bit of difference between the heavens and the earth.
Good.
And it gives a little bit more of a description than saying the whole world.
Right.
It's kind of like where he could just say evildoers. He doesn't have to say all those
right.
descriptions, but it gives us a little bit more thought of what those pieces might be.
Good. Yeah. So yes, there's two things going on. One is, yes, God created those things. And at the same time, there's this also, there's sort of a lingering idea that there was, there was something there at the beginning of creation too, that heaven and earth, they were created, but then they were split from one another, right? The sky and the earth were the earth and the water were separated, and the sky and the water were, right? So there's sort of those primordial elements, right? And also, like you said, God could have just said, listen up, or, Isaiah and Moses and everyone could have said just the whole world. This idea of heaven and earth is actually kind of, there's a specific Bible studies term for this kind of idea. The word of the day is hendiadys, Hendiadys, I think, hendiadys, which is like a single expression, but using like two words to express one thing. So like, I might say, I searched, I was looking for my keys. I searched high and low. Like I didn't literally look up and then look down. I searched everywhere. It's two words, high and low, to mean one thing everywhere, right? Everyone is welcome at Haftarah study, young and old. I don't necessarily mean specifically old people and specifically young people. I mean everybody. So it's also possible this is functioning like that as a hendiadys, heaven and earth, meaning everything, the whole universe, even though we're just naming two specific parts of it, right? Good. So if heaven and earth were the witnesses essentially at the original signing of this covenant, why is Isaiah bringing them up now?
Because the Hebrews aren't holding up their end of the covenant.
Right, and it's the witnesses who are responsible for making sure that happens, right? Good, excellent. I mean, it may be a little obvious, but it's like for understanding what's going on here, I think it's really important. In this first section, Isaiah is having God speak to the witnesses who are sort of in the jury seats at this trial, right? As Israel's being indicted for their wrongdoing.
And it also puts Israel in its place in creation. And,
oh, sure. Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, and explicitly, letting them know you are, like, you're the ones with the responsibility to uphold here that you're not fulfilling.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, let's go on. Leah, you're next on my screen. Do you mind reading at the top there, source number 4? The next few verses.
Isaiah 1,
5 to 9. Yeah, you got it.
Okay. Why do you seek further beatings, that you continue to offend? Every head is ailing, and every heart is sick. From head to foot, no spot is sound. All bruises and welts and festering sores. Not pressed out, not bound up, not softened with oil. Your land is a waste, your cities burnt down. Before your eyes, the yield of your soil is consumed by strangers. A wasteland is overthrown by strangers. Fair Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a hut, but in a cucumber field. Like a city beleaguered, has not the Lord of hosts left us some survivors? We should be like Sodom, another Gomorrah.
Yeah, that's a statement. Had not God left us some survivors, we would have been like Sodom. And yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little weird to read in this format. What the translation is trying to do is trying to replicate the kind of stanzas in Hebrew. So you'll get those capital letters, right, that look like they don't belong. It's like comma, new line. Like that's sort of two lines in parallel with one another. So they're sort of independent. Anyway, yeah, it makes it a little weird to read. You did a great job. Okay. So in the last section, God was talking to the witnesses, right, to heaven and earth. Who's being addressed now?
Seems like he's addressing the people who are doing all these bad things and telling them
Good.
What all the horrible things will be from what they're doing.
Okay. So that leads into my next question. So you're right. So it's not the heavens and earth that are getting beaten here, right? It's the people of Israel. So we've changed who's being addressed. The sort of imagined prosecutor in the courtroom, which I think in this case is God, has turned away from the jury seats to the defendant and is now addressing them directly. Are we talking about the future or are we talking about the past? What's your impression here?
I would say the past, because if the Assyrians had come in and had destroyed various things, didn't you say this was?
Yes.
Assyria had already taken care of the northern kingdom, and so he's making reference to what had happened there.
Good. So I think that's the case based on what we know of Isaiah's historical context. It's not totally clear, right? Like it starts out saying, why do you seek further beatings? As if like saying, here's what's going to happen if you continue to offend. You're going to, it feels like there's a little sense of like, this is what you have coming to, but I think given the circumstances, it makes sense to read Isaiah as talking about the past here. So what were the beatings that he's talking about? I think you're right. It's that invasion by Assyria. I left off the part of what happened to the southern kingdom there for this moment. But the Assyrian army came in and conquered and destroyed the northern kingdom in about 722, but they didn't stop there. They continued south and warred against the southern kingdom as well. And in fact, besieged Jerusalem in about the year 701. Now, notably, Jerusalem was not captured. As we read in the parallel account here, and this is sources 5, 6, 7, I've just snipped out little bits from the story as it appears here. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, and remember, Isaiah was active during the reign of Hezekiah. King Sancherib, Sennacherib sounds like you're having a snack of ribs, so I like the Hebrew pronunciation. Sancherib of Assyria marched against all the fortified towns of Judah and seized them. Skipping ahead a little bit, there's a whole story about, it's actually really it's a great read. There's the whole bit about the kind of the Rabshakeh, the Assyrians' emissary, basically comes and speaks directly to the people in Hebrew saying, you're all going to die, just give up, all this stuff. I left that out because we don't have time to cover it all, but who shows up in the book of Kings but Isaiah, son of Amos, who sends the message to Hezekiah. Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, I've heard the prayer you've offered to me concerning King Sennacherib of Assyria. In other words, this is all stuff I've cut out. This is mostly just to show you that Isaiah shows up here. In other words, God's got to intervene and make sure things work out okay. And how does that happen? And this is just the continuation of Isaiah's words back to King Hezekiah. Assuredly, thus said the Lord concerning the king of Syria, he will not enter the city. He shall not shoot an arrow at it, or advance upon it with a shield, or pile up a siege mound against it. He shall go back by the way he came. He shall not enter the city, declares the Lord. I will protect and save the city for my sake, and for the sake of my servant David. And that night, that's the end of his speech. That night, an angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 of the Assyrian camp. The following morning, they were all dead corpses. So King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and retreated and stayed at Nineveh, which was his capital. So that's how the Bible tells the story. Why did Jerusalem not fall to the Assyrian army? Well, because Hezekiah prayed, and God responded and made sure that Jerusalem didn't fall. Sent an angel that went down and struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Sennacherib, evidently realizing he no longer has adequate force to overcome the city, turns around and goes home. Now, if that's the only source we had on this, I would be pretty skeptical. But so we know, and we know from the historical record, Jerusalem didn't fall. There's no destruction layer in Jerusalem at this point. We know it didn't happen, but this miraculous explanation is miraculous, right? Fortunately, and this part I absolutely like. The biblical studies nerd in me absolutely loves. We have a parallel account in the archaeological record from Assyria, from Sennacherib himself. So this is how the Assyrians and a lot of other ancient Near Eastern people recorded their documents. Basically, they carved in stone because that would last. Using their what they call cuneiform letters, they use a chisel to chisel the letters into the stone, and they call these prisms. They're usually 6 or 8 sided prisms that are just top to bottom text, and telling the story of the annals of the king and stuff like that. I believe there are 3 of these in existence. This is the one that's in Chicago. There's another one in Jerusalem, and I think another one in London that are basically the same prism, the same annals, just different versions. They are found in the ruins of the city of Nineveh. And sure enough, if we read these, the annals of Sennacherib, we actually get a parallel account of the siege of Jerusalem. So it says, "As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns, taken in battle with my battering rams. I took as plunder 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him, and I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns, which I captured, I gave to the kings of Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza." What, very importantly, does not happen in this account?
He didn't seize the city of, he doesn't say he seized.
Yes, right? But look at the spin.
Yeah.
Look at the spin on this. This is like classic, propaganda, basically. That this is his PR people spinning Sennacherib's failure to capture Jerusalem as greatness, right? I took all this plunder and all their people and all their stuff, and I shut him up like a caged bird. I had him. Yeah. Didn't actually conquer the city, though. But, I took his towns and gave them to Ashdod and Ekron and Gaza, right? So, this is pretty incredible archaeological find. in a lot of ways verifying some of the key details of the biblical account, basically that the Assyrians advanced beyond, after conquering the northern kingdom, advanced against Judah, did not overcome it completely, although clearly did a great deal of damage along the way. And I think if we read back in Isaiah with both the account from Second Kings and the account from the Annals of Sanherib in mind, this makes a lot more sense, right? This is clearly talking about the war that happened, all those cities destroyed, all those people taken captive, and all the animal, all that kind of stuff, right? Your land is a waste, your city's burned down. Fair Zion is left like a booth. I should point out, in case you don't know, Zion is a synonym for Jerusalem, right? So Jerusalem is left like a booth in a vineyard. I think meaning it's the only structure, within a big expanse, like a hut in a cucumber field. Okay.
2 questions.
Yeah, please.
One, that prism, how big is that?
That is a good question. I could look.
Is it as tall as a human, or is it just a small?
That's a good question. It's quite large, I'm pretty sure, but I would have to look that one up for you.
Oh, okay. My other question has to do more in general with the exaggeration of numbers.
Yeah.
I had been reading, and when they were taking the census of the number of
Sure.
people in each of the tribes, and it was like, wait a minute.
Yeah. I would not. In general, yes. Don't take the numbers presented in biblical liturgy or biblical literature without any grain of salt. You look at the beginning of the book of Genesis and you read about how all these people lived for 500 years and 600 years, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and just, lay it out there. People don't live that long, and they didn't back then either, right?
Right.
They're not, right. We're dealing to a certain extent with mythological history. And there were no careful records kept. It's not like they were counting specifically bodies. I think even in the moment, these were best guess estimates and things like that. And you can imagine it's in Sanherib's interest to puff up that number, right? Yeah. So I really have no idea how much that reflects reality versus Assyrian Assyrian public relations or propaganda or something like that, right?
Yeah, but the Israelites did the same thing. And I guess my question is, has anybody figured out what the multiplying factor was for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's consistent. I think the era that a text comes from and the context, like it's different when you're talking about the kind of mythological history in Genesis, where we're talking about lifespans versus,
right.
Death figures from a war or a plague or something like that, right? Yeah, I'm not totally sure if there's a consistent multiplying factor or not. I think in general, like it's always sort of, they're always just arbitrary numbers that stand in for like a lot of people.
Yeah,
something like that, right? So that's really hard to say. I did do a quick Google for you here on the Annals of Sanherib. So the prisms contain 6 paragraphs of cuneiform written in Akkadian. They are hexagonal in shape, made of baked clay, and stand 38 centimeters high. 14 centimeters wide. So not actually that large.
No.
Yeah. But if these were supposed to be stored in, in the palace or something like that, that kind of makes sense. If you want to ever take them out to read them, you can't always, they got to be movable. There are ones that were like, they would sometimes make it a monument and write the whole annals on the side of the monument.
Right. I was thinking it like
rooted in the ground.
Babel.
That was a thing too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
That was great.
What you're doing. It was bugging me.
Yeah, no, that was wonderful. So let's see, what else did I have to say about this? Okay, so Right. We're talking about the past. We're talking about the Assyrian advance against Jerusalem. Why bring up Sodom and Gomorrah? Like, what do you think is the force of that line from Isaiah to the people?
They were destroyed by fire.
Yeah.
They were evil. They practiced a lot of iniquity.
Good. Yes. So they're in a lot of ways the archetypal biblical examples of wicked people destroyed for being wicked, right? Good. Yes, we'll see them come up again in a little bit as well. But I think as long as we're pointing out how this text would have, how this speech would have landed with people listening to it, they would have known right away what Isaiah was, why Isaiah was making that comparison, what that would have meant, right? Good. As we noted, one of Isaiah's running themes is the inviolability of Jerusalem, and here, he's saying Zion is left. Had God not saved it, we would have been destroyed too. And later biblical and later Jewish writers respond in various ways to Isaiah's prophecies regarding Israel or Jerusalem's eternal status. It's one of Isaiah's themes that clearly doesn't, stand the test of time. But just wanted to point out, as long as we're seeing sort of him covering all his greatest hits in this one opening text, there's one of them. Okay, let's go on and read a little more past the Annals of Sancheriv. Amy, has your niece had a baby yet?
Yeah,
she disappeared.
Girl,
It's
all doing well.
You disappeared for a minute. I hope that was the good news.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah, Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem, indeed. Well, in celebration, would you mind doing a little reading for us? Source number 9 up there.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Hear the word of the Lord, you chieftains of Sodom.
Yeah.
Give ear to our God's instruction, you folk of Gomorrah.
Yeah,
what need have I of all your sacrifices, says the Lord? I am sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. That you come to appear before me? Who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Bringing oblations is futile. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath, proclaiming solemnities, assemblies with iniquity, I cannot abide. Your new moon and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They are become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime.
I love the dramatic reading here. This paragraph just punches me in the face. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is just like an absolute ringing denunciation here. What does it seem like is going on in Jerusalem that Isaiah is railing against here? What's going on?
They're mouthing the words, but they're not really bringing them into their lives, because they're doing all these other things.
Good. Let's say a little more about that. How that is a problem. How doing the rituals, saying the words, but without these what'd you say making a part of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Let's unpack that a little bit. What does that mean?
It's
not in their hearts.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Stephanie, go ahead and say it again.
It's not in their hearts.
Hmm.
It's just coming out of their mouths, but it's not in their heart.
So what I'm hearing is that these rituals should be sort of organic outgrowths of real commitment.
Yeah.
To covenant, including all those, including the parts that are not just prescribing religious ritual, but prescribing things like justice and mercy and care for the vulnerable, stuff like that. Doing one without the other, it's empty, it's hollow, it's maybe hypocritical, something like that. Amy, were you going to say something similar or add to that?
Yeah, lip service, not sincere. They aren't living the law.
Good. So this is a really key point. I mean, so this is in a lot of ways like a quintessential prophetic message, right? That religion without, or the forms of religious practice without sincere commitment to values, things like social economic justice, is just is empty. It's hypocritical. It's and not only that, explicitly rejected by God. It actually makes God angry that you would think to do that without without also accompanying that with righteous action towards other people, right?
Well, it reminds me, in fact, I thought of it as we were reading that, of the other thing of Isaiah, which talks about the thunder and the lightning and winds up with what he really wants is the still small voice.
Right, when we were talking about Elisha or Elijah from that.
Oh, it's Elijah. Okay,
yeah.
I had the prophets mixed up.
Right. That's okay. Yeah. So what's your connection there?
Well, the connection is that God really doesn't want to hear all this. He wants something different. And Stephanie, was it you who said about the heart?
Yeah.
And the heart isn't very loud. You really have to listen very carefully to hear the heart.
Good. Yeah. I think I can see how those, like, they're different takes, but on a similar message, right? That it's not the kind of big grand stuff, just like it's not the the sort of superficial gestures of religious piety. It's something more subtle, something more internal. Right? See how you're get that both from Elijah and from Isaiah. Good.
Yeah, it's often said we're a religion of action, and clearly the Israelites weren't acting the way they were supposed to.
Good. Yeah, this is a text that a lot of people since Isaiah have gone back to make that same point. That it's that it matters what you do vis-a-vis other people, over and above just about everything. That was certainly one of the texts the rabbis come back to make that point. Okay, let's go on. We got a little bit more to read here, and let's get a sense exactly of what it is that the Israelites are doing wrong. Stephanie, we're back to you. Do you mind reading source number 10 there?
Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wronged. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. Come, let us reach an understanding, says the Lord. Be your sins like crimson, they can turn snow white. Be they red as dyed wool, they can become like fleece. If then you agree and give heed, you will eat the good things of the earth. But if you refuse and disobey, you will be devoured by the sword. For it was the Lord who spoke.
Excellent. So here we have it sort of pointed out explicitly what the nature of the hypocrisy is, right? They are, doing evil, but the things named specifically: justice, aiding the wronged, upholding the rights of the orphan, defending the widow, right? If this were read aloud in a courtroom, what might you call this part? And I couldn't think of the specific legal term here, which is, it suits us as non-lawyers just fine. But what might you call this if say the prosecuting attorney was reading this out in a courtroom?
It wouldn't be closing arguments.
No, it's still at the beginning of the trial, right?
Oh.
We haven't really considered evidence or anything, right? Yet.
I don't know. I can't get that because it doesn't seem that the prosecuting attorney would tell the wrongdoers what they can do to become to become good. But I also wanted to say, I know this is a little different. I just love the image of the crimson turning white.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, let's circle back to that in a second.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So I think you're right. There's not really a moment in the courtroom where the prosecution says, here's what we want from the defendant. That, I think, it's based on the little bit I know from, courtroom dramas and things like that. Like this may be what goes on between the lawyers, in one of their offices or in one of the chambers of the courthouse, right? It's like they're, the prosecution is saying, here's the redress that we're seeking for the damages you've caused, right? Here's our proposal for a settlement.
Yeah, I was going to say, just before sentencing.
Okay, I can see it there too. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, maybe that's right. Yeah, actually, and that maybe makes more sense. We've already agreed that the defendant is guilty. What do we want them to do as part of their,
it's like, okay, modern example would be that somebody has been convicted of drunk driving.
Sure.
But if they go and take a class,
right,
then it will be expunged from their record.
Sure, and maybe also do some community service, or tell their story, things along those lines, right? Here's how you can make it right to some extent, right? Yeah, I think that's what this is. This is God telling the people, yeah, you're guilty, but here's what you can do to get back on the right path. And yeah, the metaphors are vivid here, right? And wash yourself clean. It's like you're covered in grime from all the wrong you're doing. And your sins like crimson, they can turn snow white. Yeah, what do you make of the sin? I can't remember what they call it. The idea that like colors have feelings and emotions and sort of emotional resonance attached to them. What do you make of the sins being red? You know what I mean?
With blood.
Right. Like it immediately calls to mind blood. And so the sinning you're doing is, maybe you're not literally murdering, but we're comparing it to that, right? We're comparing the way you're treating the orphan and the widow in some way to shedding their blood, without explicitly doing that, by calling it crimson,
Right. Well, yeah, within our tradition, even when you humiliate a person, it's said to bring blood to their face, causing maybe them to turn red or blush.
Yeah, first they turn red and then they turn white.
Yeah.
Is the way the rabbis see it. The term in rabbinics is whitening somebody's face, because first they get flushed with embarrassment and then they turn white from, the blood drains from their face as they're, fully embarrassed.
But this is such a beautiful image of a forgiving, loving God, and what the power of our own teshuvah could be.
Good. So
yeah,
excellent tie-in. We're teasing the sort of reflective questions later when we ask about why is this the Haftarah right before Tisha B'Av, and why is this 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av is seen as kind of the opening of the season of repentance leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So I think it's very appropriate that that's the note hit by this Haftarah here, is like, yeah, you done goofed. You screwed up. And also, God is here to tell you can make it right. You can get back on the right path. Whatever you've done, you can, it's never too late to do tshuva, right? To do repentance and change your behavior, right? And and realize the consequences if you don't. You'll be devoured by the sword.
But the glorious consequences if you do.
Right. Yeah. And I think I would definitely bring this text. There's a certain stereotype, from the Christian perspective of sort of New Testament God of love and Old Testament God of vengeance, right? Like, there's certainly like that promise of destruction for failure, but also like clearly holding out the, not saying, you're already, there's no coming back from this. It's not vengeance, for sure or above all else. Like it's saying you could fix it. You could change your behavior, right? Which is, from Judaism, what it's from the Jewish perspective, what it's all about, right? It's never too late to do the right thing. It's funny. My daughter and I watched Star Wars, the original Star Wars trilogy, a few months ago, and that was what we talked about at the end when Darth Vader, decides to save Luke from the Emperor, despite that he's done all this stuff wrong. It's never too late to do the right thing, right? Same kind of idea. There's a lot of great Torah in Star Wars, but that's a different class. Okay, let's take it home. So the other thing I wanted to note is just remember, I noted that at the beginning, I'll flip back to show you. The Lord has spoken. It's the beginning of God's speech here in verse 2. We get here, for it was the Lord who spoke. So that's the sort of book ending of this section, saying this is one speech. This is one literary unit. The Haftarah is not over. We get another brief unit coming up after that, but that's one of the ways biblical literature sort of marks off boundaries of units. So we got one more here, and let's see. I think it's Leia's turn to read. Yeah, you mind?
Second.
All right.
Alas, she has become a harlot, the faithful city that was filled with justice. What righteousness dwelt, but now murders. Your silver has turned to dross, your wine is cut with water. Your rulers are rogues and cronies of thieves, everyone avid for presents and greedy for gifts. They do not judge the case of the orphan, and the widow's cause never reaches them. Assuredly, this is the declaration of the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel. Oh, I will get satisfaction from my foes. I will wreak vengeance on my enemies. I will turn my hand against you and smelt out your dross as with lye, and remove all your slag. I will restore your magistrates as of old, and your counselors of yore. After that you shall be called City of Righteousness, Faithful City. Zion shall be saved in the judgment, her repentant ones in the retribution.
Okay. So this is another unit that concludes the Haftarah. And actually, it doesn't conclude the chapter. Interesting, the last few verses of the chapter, I think, end on something of a down note. The line continues, truly you shall be shamed, things like that. So I think that they deliberately end the Haftarah here so that we're left on this up note, right? You shall be called City of Righteous. You'll be saved in judgment. It's at least leading on ending on a hopeful note. I would argue, though, that this bit is its own little unit. Can you identify the framing device here at the book ending the beginning and the end? You're usually looking for some kind of repeated language.
Well, there's a sense of loss because of what was and what is now. Is that what you mean?
Sure. Okay, good. Yeah, so that's definitely speaking to the the force of this whole thing, or of this whole unit, that you were on the right path at one point and you've lost that.
You were faithful, now you're a harlot. You were righteous, now you're murdered.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
that's
right.
yeah.
Good.
It's kind of that rhythm.
Yeah.
You even cut your wine with water. Oh, oy.
Well, that actually would have made sense. Would have made a lot of sense to them, and that's how wine was prepared in those days. Is it was like super concentrated, and that you would actually cut it with water in order to make it drinkable, because otherwise it was way too sour and way too potent to actually drink. But you could certainly overdo that, and you could end up with really watered down wine.
He uses the feminine.
Good. Okay. So, yeah. Go ahead.
He has become a harlot and her repentant ones.
Okay. So who's she? Who's her?
Israel.
The people. No,
I think Leah was about to say it.
Judah.
I was going to say Jerusalem.
I think it's
but-
Jerusalem, right?
Okay.
She has
Yeah.
become a harlot, the faithful city, right? Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's, yeah, I mean, I have no idea how far back that tradition goes of sort of naming, the idea that cities are somehow personified as feminine. It certainly holds up in Hebrew grammar. Cities are always treated as, and in fact, any place name is always treated as a feminine noun grammatically in Hebrew. But yeah, I mean, it's not great here. I think the idea of, female personification in the negative, like it's utilized to say, it's like a woman sleeping around, right? Which is a passing judgment on, women's sexual activity that is not, parallel for men. So I just want to acknowledge that that's not great here, but it is, part of his, a common rhetorical style at the time. Isaiah's not the only one who does this, so not to make excuses for it, but to note it and to name that. So yeah, but I think it is talking about like Jerusalem is personified as the woman who has gone astray, right? Who was, who was at one point filled with justice and righteousness. There's sort of a framing going on. I see, he repeats the words faithful city at the beginning and at the end. Let's see, where were the other ones I noted? Righteousness is in that first line, and then also in the end, I think indicating that, this is sort of a unit to itself with one coherent message. Yeah, Amy, you did a great job naming, sort of how these metaphors, he talks about silver turned to dross, wine cut with water, rulers who are now rogues and cronies of thieves, right? How they sort of all describe what's happened to Jerusalem, that they had at one point good and nice stuff because they were doing the right thing. And now you still have that stuff, right? You still have your silver, you still have your wine, you still have your rulers, but they're corrupted somehow, right? I don't know enough about metallurgy or whatever to know exactly what dross and slag and things are and what it means to smelt out dross as with lye. I can only assume that's some sort of purification process. Remove all your slag. It seems like, there's something corrupted about your metal now.
Well, slag is impurities.
Yeah, it's got to be something like that, right? So removing that will somehow return the metal to its purified state, like same kind of deal. It's clearly, the message is if you get back on the right path and start, caring for the widow and doing justice, you can remove those impurities and get back to the way things were. Your leaders can be your counselors as of your magistrates as of, actually that line in verse 26 is part of the liturgy in the weekday Amidah. There's a one blessing that's all about basically, but yeah, it's the name of the paragraph. I think it's for Mishpat, but yeah, it has that line right in there. Good.
Very touching, though, how the impact of individual action just creates a whole city of just of corruption.
Yeah, and actually, the traditional commentators read the part about silver turned to dross as metaphor for business, and infer that people were cheating in business and potentially debasing currency, which in that day and age would have looked literally like, you would have a silver coin worth, one, weighing a certain amount of silver, shaving little bits of that off, right? Things like literally debasing currency, and leading immoral lives. So exactly, that's how this is understood through traditional commentary too. It's like individual actions leading to the corruption of society.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Where he says, I will get satisfaction from my hooks.
That was my next question too. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, who is he talking about?
Yeah, that was my next question too. Who do you think he's talking about? Yeah, who do you think he's talking about? Right, I suppose,
Maybe
this is Isaiah speaking for God, right? Who is God talking about?
maybe there are just a few people or some people within the Israelites who have been able to turn them into people who have done all these things. I don't know.
So, okay, I think that's definitely a possibility. That it could be the foes, could be the wicked people among in Judah, right? I think that's possible. Any other ideas? Like, it's not at all clear.
No. I mean, who could be God's foes?
Well, people who don't.
Other gods?
People who worship other gods, yeah, meaning
Right.
Baal and
sure, who are the gods of other foreign nations, right?
Yeah.
So that's the interpretation that I would tend towards. I think the idea that it's, satisfaction for my foes, vengeance on my enemies. I think it's totally possible to read that as, the wicked ones among Israel. I'll turn my hand against you, and it's like you are the dross, you are the slag that I'm going to spelt out. I think that's totally plausible. I think I would lean a little more towards the kind of bigger picture of I'm going to get satisfaction on my foes. In other words, those foreign nations who I'm actually, who I'm against, but who I'm utilizing as the instrument of your punishment. That's kind of how the whole thing is framed, is that the reason Assyria came is because God brought them in to punish Israel, for what they were doing wrong. So, eventually they're going to get their comeuppance, right? And I'll get my vengeance on them. But first, I'm going to turn my hand against you and purify you using them. Then we'll turn around and get justice, right? Or get vengeance. So I lean towards that, but I think both are very plausible given the ambiguity. Yeah, sorry, who was going to say something? Amy, go ahead.
That's okay.
Oh, okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think both are plausible.
This doesn't actually say that Israel will start to do the right thing, but it kind of says, I will do this if you will do that, even though it doesn't say
right
if you will do that. But it seems like it must be supposing that the Israelites will turn from their bad ways back to God, and then he will do this. But maybe not. Maybe
it's
not ahead of it and show them, here, I can do this for you, and hopefully you'll return to me.
Yeah, it's not all the way. It doesn't prophesy about the outcome, right? It doesn't really address what's ultimately going to happen. If we were to try to sort of characterize this unit, I would say it's something like lament, right? Lament for what we had and what we have now, but also hope, right? Open-ended hope, but hope that we can get back to right, but there's no indication of
an alternative possibility is presented.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the Haftarah. So let's turn for a couple of minutes and discuss some of those questions about the big picture. Thinking back over what we read, how do you think this text would have spoken to people at the time when it was written? Imagine you were.
I apologize. I've really enjoyed our study together.
You gotta get going. That's okay.
I have to go. Yeah.
Not at all. Of course.
Thanks for your input.
Take care. Stephanie and Leah, it's up to you. What do you think? If you were a Jerusalemite hearing Isaiah, what would you think?
Well, I don't really know the history of what was going on in that period, so it's kind of hard to say.
Sure. I mean, we've talked about the big picture kind of political history, right? We don't know exactly what life was like in Jerusalem at that point. But
is Isaiah the first of the various prophets?
No, you mean chronologically the earliest? No.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I was thinking if this is the first time
Ah,
that these people have been addressed like this, they
mhm.
would probably be irritated.
So it's not the first time, but I think
Okay,
irritate is a pretty valid response to this. Like no one likes being told that you're screwing up, right?
right.
Like, this is it's a pretty potent rebuke, a wake up call or something. It's a dire warning. I mean, like he doesn't go exactly into details about exactly how the destruction or what that's going to be like. That he gets into that later. We get the part about bruises and welts and festering sores, but it's sort of talking about the past. It's still a pretty searing bit of rebuke. Like, I don't
Right.
know. I imagine I could have, depending on what I felt, like about myself, maybe what my position was in the power structure in Jerusalem, if I was a noble or a ruler or something like that, versus if I was a peasant,
Yeah.
how I would react to that. Would I say, like, yeah, this is talking directly to me and I hate it, or would I say, view this as like this is talking to my social order superiors, and Isaiah's right on here with this.
Right.
I think both are
Well,
possible.
and then maybe some at the top uh, would not feel it's talking about them or wanting to cover up
Sure,
what they had been doing.
sure.
Speaking of contemporary,
Okay, yeah, hang on. We'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I
Leah.
just wonder the very, very first little introductory part
Sure.
mentions, well, I think it's four kings.
Yep.
Yeah, four kings. And what were they like? And did that
Mm,
kind of lead to the downfall of Jerusalem?
that's a good
Or I
question.
just don't know. Like I say, the history is,
Yeah, yeah, and I would have to go back into the Book of Kings to double check that. Hezekiah gets a good reputation. Uh,
oh,
I think it's a bit results oriented in that Hezekiah wins his war, therefore he must have been doing the right thing in
mhm,
some fashion. But he's also known for a series of religious reforms, rooting out paganism and things like that, and other foreign practices um, from the temple cult and stuff like that. I don't remember about Uzziah, Yotam, and Achaz. In the Book of Kings, it usually says, King so and so reigned for X number of years, and either he did what was pleasing to the Lord or he did what was not pleasing to the Lord, and they're sort of summed up like that. And I don't remember what the verdict is on these guys. I think we're sort of getting at the idea that people who are doing the wrong thing are not necessarily self-aware of that. They think of all sorts of ways to rationalize to themselves what it is they're doing. It's just business, or something like that. And so, if you're deep into that, you're really rationalizing yourself whatever it is you're doing, no matter how abusive it is. Something like this could really come and upset, and maybe you know
well, and
wouldn't necessarily listen to it. It certainly seems like the people did not listen to this.
and it also it's like a gradual slippery slope,
Mm-hmm.
and everything maybe started out well, but part of it is human nature as gets applied to everyday living,
Sure.
and what maybe in past times had been unacceptable behavior has gradually it's become acceptable
Yeah, or at least
practice.
sort of normalized, maybe.
Yeah, normalized, good
Yeah.
word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that's certainly how it seems like things work in societies. Yeah.
Human beings are not perfect.
Yeah, clearly. How do you think this text would have spoken to Jewish communities in between then and now? It was selected, and I think it's the same for Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Although this is definitely the Ashkenazi reading, if not both Ashkenazi and Sephardi. It's been selected as the reading for just before Tisha B'Av, right? So I don't know. How do you see it as effective, or how does it kind of set us up for Tisha B'Av?
Well, with the is there writing somewhere that the two temples were destroyed because of the bad things that the Israelites did, or
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much, that's the rabbinic understanding. So the rabbis who lived in the immediate aftermath of the Second Temple's destruction, had to try to grapple with it theologically. How could God allow this to happen to God's city? Because they would have known Isaiah, who had prophesied as Jerusalem will never fall. Here's Jerusalem now fallen. How could this have happened? Must have been because we didn't listen to the warnings, right? So the big idea they come up with is sinat chinam, baseless hatred, and that the people of Judah were treating each other, so poorly, and especially the vulnerable people in society, that this was essentially, the prophecy come true, retribution and purification by foreign power coming and destroying.
Okay.
Okay.
So after the diaspora, diaspora, pardon me. Then with the scattering, then there became the problem of assimilation.
Sure.
And in assimilation, then people were dropping their practices.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, a warning that too much assimilation and dropping of practices and attitudes and their hearts and identity that could lead to destruction.
So that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about how this text speaks vis-a-vis, life in the diaspora. And, I think this, Isaiah would have understood any sort of destruction or exile as punishment in and of itself, regardless of what you do, in that community. I'm not sure he's necessarily thinking along those lines, but, imagining diaspora communities over the last 2,000 years reading this, how they would have heard it. It's an interesting question if it speaks to assimilation. I guess my thought had been, is there some kind of, because it speaks about purification, right? Basically suffering as a part of a process of purification. Like maybe folks would have read this, who were going through the Crusades and the Inquisition and stuff like that. Maybe could have heard this as somehow like my suffering for being a Jew is a process of purification, or somehow part of a divine plan, something along those lines. Like I think that's one of the ways people have understood it, and just trying to make sense out of suffering. That was my best idea, but I hadn't considered the sort of the diaspora existence side. I don't know.
Well, you asked the question between then and now.
Sure.
And without looking at today specifically,
sure,
isn't one of the things that I don't know who, but compares, again, wrongdoings by the Jews with what happened in the Holocaust.
Sure. I mean,
and then you get Israel, which is the formation of Israel, which is the hope and
sure,
the reward or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so that is one theological perspective on the Holocaust. It's not at all like the predominant one, I don't think.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well,
in connection with this,
right,
with Tisha B'Av is what I'm thinking of.
Sure.
Is where that's mentioned.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, basically any modern theology has to take the Holocaust into consideration to be worth anything at all. And I think for the most part, like, we stopped short of saying we deserved it somehow with the Holocaust, although there certainly have been people who have said that, that, the reason people were wiped out is because their mezuzahs weren't kosher or whatever. That's generally perceived, and I would say that's extremist. That's victim blaming. There's no way that people deserved the destruction of the Holocaust. In any, no God I believe in could believe and would do that. So yes, this is theology that's foreign to my worldview, but within the framework of God punishes people who are wrong and rewards those who do good, it makes a certain amount of sense. And certainly relates to Tisha B'Av in exactly in that way of Tisha B'Av was another example of people doing the wrong thing and getting punished for it. Whereas this is sort of the, having this be the Haftarah read in advance of that says they should have known better. They were duly warned by Isaiah generations earlier, right? How does this speak to you now? Now's your chance, Stephanie, if you wanted to lay into the administration or whoever.
Well, I guess in some ways, the time we are living right now, it speaks very, very loudly that so many people are turning their heads or ignoring what's going on and all of the destructiveness. I mean, the migrants locked up, all the horrible things that are being done that are an antithesis of what we should be doing and how we should be treating people and everything. And Isaiah is saying, hey, wake up or you're going to be in big trouble.
Yeah.
For destruction.
Yeah.
And there are some modern day people who are saying, hey, if we don't stop this, we may never survive. We as a country.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, to put an even finer point on it, the fact that there are people who understand themselves as religious people wrapped up in that kind of mistreatment of migrants, of all sorts of what I would consider injustices. It's frustrating to me that this is a Jewish text addressed to Jews and not one that's more universally addressed, because I got to be honest, I see a lot of Jews living their values, out there on the forefront of trying to defend the rights of migrants and things like that.
And African Americans.
And sure, African American, everybody vulnerable in the society. The Bible's go-to list is widow, widow, orphan,
orphans,
and widow, orphan. What's the other one? But it's like a laundry list of everyone who's vulnerable in the society. I see a lot of Jews out there doing that. I mean, yeah, should more of us do it? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a whole host of other people who consider themselves religious, but ostensibly are reading the same text, but to my eyes are not acting.
No, they're definitely not.
That's absolutely true. Leah, do you have anything to say about modern resonance for you here?
No, I don't think. I think we covered it with I guess the only thing that comes to me when we read the end of this, and especially this last little section, that there is hope. And if we do the right things and the social justice part, which we read earlier, if we do that, there is hope for redemption.
Good. Hey, that's great, Leah. You're just like the Haftarah. You're ending us on an upbeat note. We need that. Yes, absolutely. There is hope, and that's the ultimate message in a lot of places. Certainly here, as bad as it might be, the possibility is there for the future.
Mm.
Good. Thanks, Leah.
But we have to take the action. It's
Yep.
God is not going to give us this. We really have to
Yep.
do things. It's
Yep.
kind of like God doesn't just make this happen. We do have to do something toward it.
Yeah.
We do have to take
Absolutely.
action.
Yep. Well, you get the last word, Leah. That was wonderful.